I think there's an anecdote in your book where I think Bud Powell is talking to Billy Taylor, and Billy Taylor is saying, I'm really trying to learn Art Tatum's style, and Bud Powell is saying, I'm actually more interested in what Charlie Parker is doing.
Oh, I'm glad you chose that. I think it's an important moment in the Bud Powell narrative, in his development. And Billy Taylor gave it to me himself. Billy Taylor was a wonderful historian, really, of the music, as well as a great pianist. And I think Dr. Taylor, as we called him, told me this story to indicate that for Taylor, it was all about technique on the instrument. And of course, Tatum was the ne plus ultra. Nobody had more technique than Art Tatum,
Yeah.
not in the history of jazz. And there isn't a jazz musician alive who will say otherwise. There's something about Art Tatum's ability that even the great classical pianists came to watch him play. He had so much. So for Taylor, nothing was more important than mastering his instrument, and there was no one to learn from more than Art Tatum. But Powell had a lot of technique, and he wasn't insecure about that technique. He didn't feel that he needed more once he started to play with others. What interested him were ideas, and the modern ideas captivated him. So Parker, who had tremendous technique on his horn, but at a certain point, I don't think Parker continued to practice and to play scales and things. I think Parker had his technique, he was confident in it, and what he was after was ideas. So he attracted Powell because those ideas were a break from the swing music tradition. They were something beyond. In fact, even to the end of Parker's life, he was talking about avant-garde composers who interested in Edgar Varese and people like that. So Parker was a seeker after new ideas, and that's what Powell wanted to do.
Can we date that conversation he had with Billy Taylor?
I think it's about 1944, because Powell was probably still with Cootie Williams, and Taylor told me the story that it happened in a hotel, obviously a segregated hotel, 1944, and they were probably both on the road. At least Powell was with the Cootie Williams band. Taylor was from Washington, D.C. If it took place there, then Taylor was still playing locally. Or it could have been when Taylor came to New York. I don't remember. I think that was about 45 or something, 46. But I have a feeling it's in that period where Powell has not gone off on his own yet. I mean, he's still employed in an orchestra. Taylor is just getting his career going. And they were at that point where a musical conversation, they might influence each other. They were young enough and hungry. So, I think it took place at a breakfast or something. And they were eager to say, well, what are you doing? Well, what are you doing? And maybe taking ideas from each other. But Powell was impatient. He was an impulsive guy. And I think Taylor was a calmer, a more mature, emotionally mature person. So when Taylor is talking, he's talking about technique, and Powell, I think, I'm projecting now, but I think Powell got a little impatient, and that's what Taylor explained it to me. He says, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something new. That's what Bird is doing. That's what I want.
Now we get to I think everyone's interested in this topic, Bud Powell's relationship with Charlie Parker. And I'm sure that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And so obviously he was sort of enthralled with Charlie Parker at the beginning. And I mean, it's a big topic, right? So let's talk about the beginning. Do we have any research on how their relationship was at the beginning when they first met, how that was? Do we have any information there?
Only the words of musicians I was able to talk to who were very plain with me on the topic, that in those early years there was no question that Powell was, as you put it, enthralled to Parker. Parker was not only someone who was seeking new ideas, new ways of phrasing on his instrument, but Parker was brash and Parker was confident. He wasn't as outgoing as Dizzy Gillespie. He wasn't as well dressed as Miles Davis in a couple of years when he came on the scene, but Parker knew what he could do, and he attracted people who wanted to play his music. That was the key. And I think Powell saw that if you have the technique and you have the ideas, people will come around you, and then you can maybe get the kind of jobs where it's your band and people play what you're doing. They want to play your idea. So Parker already had that when Powell met him. I can't date when that was, but Parker was making records, and Parker was just, as I said, more magnetic for the way he played than for the way he looked or his anything. He was supposedly a very witty guy, but Gillespie was the real performer, so to speak, the real kind of comic performer. Parker was all about seriousness on the instrument, and I think that Powell initially idolized him. And this also comes through in musician comments that I didn't get, but in the written histories that people say, and it's a cliche, which I think needs to be downplayed. But the cliche was that Bud Powell took what Charlie Parker was doing on saxophone and translated it, or you might say transposed it to the piano. And you can hear it in some of the phrasing. There's an aggressiveness to the way he plays certain phrases. The first note of a phrase is struck very hard, and that's the way you can hear Parker often with a phrase. That first note or two are played hard, and then he sort of falls off those notes and plays softly. And that hitting that first note hard was a Powell signature, and I think he got that from Parker.
Do we know how much they played together? And do we have any information of if they played in a band, if they jammed together, at least in the early part of their relationship?
No, it's more a missed opportunity. There is a document. I think one or two recordings that were. I mean, they're not commercial recordings, but Parker appeared for a week in Cootie Williams's band, and it's hard for me to recall all this, but I think it was in February of 1945. The Cootie Williams band was playing in Harlem. It was a week or 2 week engagement. I think it's at the Apollo Theater, and Parker guested. Now, knowing Parker, I mean, he might not have shown up for every performance. He was notorious for that, and that's another thing Powell got from him, unreliability. But this comes with genius. At least they thought it did. If you're a genius, they should be grateful you show up at all, right?
Yeah.
So Parker guested with Cootie Williams in February of 45, and it's one of these unfortunate things of history that Powell's last performance with Cootie Williams was January 19th, I think it was, of 45. So had Powell not had an unfortunate incident, which is documented in the book, which forced him to leave the Cootie Williams band, they would have played together there. There's no doubt that there were jams in Harlem at that time, 44, 45. They must have appeared. But remember that Powell was on the road with the Cootie Williams band, although Harlem was still home, and Parker was gaining a lot of attention and attraction, and he was all over. Wherever anybody offered him the money, I mean, he was in demand a lot. But there's probably jams, but no, there is no recording together, no documented appearance together until 1947.
Then 1947. How did 1947 happen? It seems like you're trying to corral cats to get together, but eventually it did happen, and they did play together.
Parker was under contract to Savoy Records. He had been under contract to Dial Records and made what I think are his greatest recordings, first on the West Coast for Dial. It was started by a man in Los Angeles, I believe. And then the record company moved east to New York when this guy, picked up his business and moved it. And Parker recorded for Dial in New York. Then he recorded for Savoy, which was a New York-based label, actually a New Jersey-based label. And Parker was under contract, and so he got Miles Davis and oh boy, you're going to test me now who else is on the date. I'm a little rusty. But he got this band together, and Parker, I assume, chose Powell to play piano. So it's a legendary session. Everybody can look it up online or in a discography. And the tune that is most fondly remembered is Donna Lee.
As a historian, can you date the peak of the interest in bebop? And because I believe sometime in the 50s, people were saying they were losing interest in bebop. But what years were the peak of bebop?
1949. I think Powell, we haven't gotten into any of Powell's personal problems, and we don't need to, but Powell was off the scene. After the Parker session, it's the only record he made in 1947 was with Charlie Parker. It's the only one. And he was off the scene completely in 1948 and part of 47, the end of 47, and the beginning of 49. So that's the bad news. The good news is that when he came out in April from the hospital in April of 49, bebop or modern jazz was all over Midtown. The segregation laws, they weren't really laws, they were just practices. The clubs were becoming open, and it was integrated bands, and there were integrated audiences, and this is really the flowering of modern jazz. And 52nd Street was the axis around which so much activity rotated, and Powell was there for it. And he was so eager to play. He came out in 49 April, and everybody wanted him, and he wanted to be with everybody. So you could say that's when the modern thing is at its peak. And Powell's greatest period, that is a period of his celebrity, the period where his technique is at its peak, where he's getting a lot of record dates, he's writing, and some of the stuff he's creating on the fly. I mean, he didn't always write things down ahead of time, but he had that ability, as Parker did, to maybe have nothing more than a sketch, enter a recording session, and then flesh things out verbally or demonstrating on the piano. And it's 49 to 51. That's his greatest records, and that's where he's intersecting with all these other great artists, including Sonny Stitt, and that's both his great period and the great period for bebop.
That's a great segue, because at some point the relationship with Charlie Parker just, I guess, absolutely deteriorated, because there's a famous scene that you detail very brilliantly in your book where it's, I guess, one of the final gigs that they do, and it's an absolute travesty. I mean, it's just a performance that's falling apart. Charles Mingus was there. Charlie Parker's trying to run a gig, and it's just failing. Bud Powell's being very difficult. Could you talk about that? How many perspectives you got of that famous falling out?
Oh, thank you for mentioning the number. I think I had 9 different perspectives, as many of them from living interviewees as I could, and I favored the people whom I could pretty much tell were really there. I call it the Last Supper. Parker to me was the ultimate martyr in jazz. He died at the same age as Jesus Christ, and to me, as soon as he died, people saying "Bird lives" and all that. I mean, he was a figure, a charismatic figure, because of his extraordinary talent. That I think to this day, that in fact this is the centenary. Charlie Parker was born in 1920, and I hope there's going to be some activities about that. He was just he picked up that horn, and Dizzy Gillespie said he was a Pied Piper. Powell, I think, when he started to his celebrity rose, felt, well, what about me? Why don't people congregate around me the way they do around him? I can do everything on my instrument that he does on the saxophone. So for this last gig, whether Powell consciously decided to sabotage it or whether he was just very sick, and I do document some unfortunate incidents that happened in the lead up to this. So it's rather than saying definitively, well, Powell just wanted to screw it up because it was Parker's gig and not Powell's, right? This was Birdland, and Powell had played at Birdland many, many, many times. I think he was also the circumstances of Powell's mental health at the time. But I talked to everybody I could who was there. There's a couple of people who claim to have been there, but I don't think they were. I think that many years later, because it was Parker's last gig, the Last Supper, I think that the incidents that happened were blown out of proportion, and that people who weren't there wanted to pretend they were. so that some celebrity would rub off on them. So it all is in the book. It's unfortunate, no matter whose perspective you follow or believe in, but it was clearly a breakdown, and Powell hardly played at all. Parker left the stage terribly upset. Charles Mingus tried to hold things together. Art Blakey tried to hold things together, but it was a disaster. Very little music was played until I think the second or third set, where Parker just played some blues, and Kenny Dorham played well that night by most accounts. But it's a historic event for the wrong reason.
Yes, exactly. Can I actually step a little bit earlier than that? And there was this, I think it was an anecdote where I think Lenny Tristano and Charlie Parker are sitting, and Bud Powell just walks up to them and just rips into Charlie Parker and just tells him he's like not playing well, or just,
Yeah.
I'm not sure can you talk about that anecdote and where you got that from?
Well, that I got from a book, so I'm always wary when I do that. In fact, I did something that no reader has noticed, but it was important to me to do it for history, where I have an anecdote that I got from a printed source, and the printed source seems to have gotten the anecdote from another printed source, or where you could it's just palimpsest. It's just so many layers, and the harder it is. The more layers there are, the harder it is to believe the actual words. So I put extra quote marks around these kind of things to signal, well, I don't know. This is what I read somewhere, and where I read it, he got it from someone else. And, it's just between oral traditions and written traditions, things get very murky when you're trying to determine the truth. All I know is that according to one printed source, which was based on somebody's hearsay, Tristano, who idolized Parker, was sitting with him in a club, and probably was Birdland. And Powell saw that, and I'm going to guess that he was jealous that Tristano was talking to Parker and not Powell. And he just wanted to take a swipe at him. So he said, I won't repeat the exact words, but he said he was playing, that it was nothing, that Parker was just a shell of himself. He was falling back on old routines, and that is when he bothered to show up. He wasn't the great talent anymore, and it was Powell's way of saying, I'm the boss now. I'm the big name. And Powell was also probably at this time, he also had gone through his problems. In fact, they were both hospitalized at Bellevue, which was an observation ward for potential psychiatric patients. They were both hospitalized there. At the end of 1954, I think they were, it's like two guys missing each other at a club, only they missed each other at a hospital. They were both there, maybe a few weeks apart, but that shows you how both of their careers were in decline because of substance abuse and emotional problems. So here's Powell seeing Parker. Parker's in decline, so Powell feels, let me take a swipe at him, but Powell wasn't doing any better.